Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are doing well. I'm excited to start our new study together. I do wish that we could be in person to do this. I think this is kind of a class that maybe we'd have a few more questions and some good conversation about, but maybe we'll swing back around and when we start our classes in person, we can kind of pick up some of these questions if you've got them. Obviously, of course, you can ask them to me either in an email or in a Facebook chat or in the group me or in a comment under the video, however is going to be best for you. And I'll be happy to try to get to some of that stuff. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to start our new Bible class on 2 Peter and Jude. Now 2 Peter and Jude are very, very different. They are some of the strangest epistles in some ways in the New Testament. It's one of the reasons that they don't get taught very much. They don't get preached through very much. We'll kind of discuss why some of that is as we go through. It's probably why, and I poked my head into David's office the other day when he happened to be in while I was in as well, and say, is this why, you taught 1 Peter, but you didn't teach 2 Peter, and typical David, he just kind of laughed and didn't answer the question. So, but I think we're going to really enjoy these once we get into them. I think that we'll see, even by the end of the class today, why I think that they might be so relevant to what we're doing. But I kind of tip the hand a little bit and describe what I mean by that. And that is that 2 Peter in particular, and we are going to start with 2 Peter and then we will go to Jude. 2 Peter in particular is different from any other letter in the New Testament in that it is not written to a specific group of Christians. It's not like the Ephesian letters where Paul's like, hey, I'm going to write this to the Ephesians. It's not like the Corinthians. It's not like the Galatians or most of, maybe with the exception of Ephesians, written to a specific group at a specific time. Instead, it's not even like what we have in 1 Peter, where Peter says, okay, I'm going to write this to a whole big group of different Christians in Asia Minor. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it is written to the church as a whole. I mean, that's how it starts out in the very first verse of 2 Peter, verse 1. To those who have obtained a faith of equal standing with ours by the righteousness of our God and Savior, Jesus Christ. I mean, that's a pretty amazing thing. That means it's linking us, those of us here at Palmetto, right? Just as much as an inheritor and a co-worker in this letter as the original Christians who received it. And that's something that we can't really say of anything else. That what we're reading here in the first, for our attempts, is like the first, mass communication or radio broadcast or major announcement in some ways written for the church. All of the Christians in the empire, written at a time when there are both Jews and Gentiles, written to a church that has some of the letters of Paul. And that's pretty incredible to see then, what would Peter want all of us to know? And I look forward to the chance to kind of getting to talk about that with us as we go forward. But to kind of get us started back there kind of at the beginning, I've entitled this class Partakers of the Divine Nature. That's how Peter's going to talk about Christians, and it's going to be a pretty important element of his discussion as he goes forward. But what I want to do this morning is I want to kind of talk about kind of the opening stuff, I guess we might say, of what's the background things that we want to talk about that we need to know, or at least kind of have in mind to better understand what's going on with Peter. This is a famous painting of of Jesus' transfiguration, which is going to play a big, huge part in what Peter is doing. Well, whenever we get to a biblical book, whenever it's an epistle or a gospel or anything else, there are kind of two major questions that we ask, right? The first one is, who's the author? In other words, who wrote it? Now, we're not going to talk about all of this today because authorship doesn't just include who wrote it, but it tells us, like, well, what do we know about the author? What is his history? What's his relationship? What are the things that have happened in his life that kind of explain what's happening here in the epistle? What are the things that we might know about Peter's life that we'd really need to understand if we're going to read the gospel or if I read this epistle and get a lot out of it? It would be related to the question of, hey, when did he write it? What's the date of authorship? You know, sorry I'm yawning so much. I wanted to get this up before the morning, and since we're getting all the girls ready, it always takes early, so I'm actually up late on Saturday night recording this for you guys. But what do we know about the date that might explain why Peter's discussing the letter like this? That'd be a good question to ask, and we're going to talk about that this morning. The other question that we want to ask is, what's the audience? In other words, to whom is the author writing? What do we know about them? Where are they from? What's their history? What's their history with the author? Why did he write this instead of something else? And why did he write now instead of some other time? What's the situation that's going on that we can kind of peek behind the scenes in terms of what we're reading and what we're seeing and what's happening, right? I mean, you can imagine that what we're doing is we are reading other people's mail. And that can be difficult. As one person described it, imagine that you're walking down by the side of the road and you see a letter and you pick it up and it's a really short letter and it says something like, Dear Jane, I'm so excited to be released. When I get home, we're going to have a party and I want you to invite Bob and Joe and Lawrence to the usual spot, and we'll party like we always do. And you're like, okay, but what does that mean? We have this discussion, but what does it mean? He says, when I get released, but released from what? Is he released from prison? That's going to change how we think about this. Is the usual spot and having this party like we always do, is this going to be some sort of like criminal enterprise? Is it where he's hidden the loot? Or does released mean like getting out of the hospital? Right? You're released from a hospital. He's better now. Maybe he had a surgery or something. Or maybe released is like he got out of the army. And unless we know something about the situation, all three of those possibilities, which would make us read this letter very differently, are on the table. And so knowing something about the author, knowing something about the audience, knowing something about when it's written, to whom it's written, what's going on behind the scenes, all of those can help us read other people's mail and get more out of it. And I think that's important because we have to realize that these letters, along like the rest of the Bible and the New Testament in particular, they may be written for us, but as David said, they're not written to us. And that's a distinction that we want to be careful to make and to remember as we go through our study of the New Testament in general. So if we're going to talk about these two things, authorship and audience, let's start with the first. Let's start with authorship. And we might ask, okay, well, how do we figure that out? In other words, if we're going to talk about authorship, how do we know what's going on? What are the things we might want to keep in mind if we're going to figure out for ourselves, if we're going to decide who wrote this? In other words, what sorts of evidence might we want to weigh? If we're going to a courtroom, if we get pulled into jury duty, for a murder crime or something else like that, we might say, okay, we've got eyewitness testimony, or we've got forensic evidence, and then we've got the history of the person. So we've got, did someone see him do the thing? And then did we find the murder weapon, or did we find whatever else? And then we can say, is this the kind of person, is this the kind of character that would go on, that would explain that's happened? Well, we don't have that exact kind of evidence, but that is the kind of thing we want to do when we are reading an epistle and trying to figure this out. There are three kinds of evidence that we might say, or really two kinds of evidence and a third thing that we do with them, when it comes to what we're going to do with authorship. And that is the first kind of evidence. The first kind of evidence is called internal evidence. And, people who come up with this stuff aren't very, inventive. It just means stuff that is internal or in the Bible itself. So when we read 2 Peter without knowing anything else, what do we know? What words does it use? What does it say? What are its concepts? What's its language? What's its style? Now, if you're like, me and like most of us, when we're reading that, we don't really pay attention too much to some of those things. What do you mean? What are its words? What do you mean? What its style, its language? And here's something where we have to be careful, because again, written for us, not to us, we have to realize that these New Testament documents, they're not written in English originally. Now, we have excellent, amazing, incredible translations. We have an embarrassment of riches. You can read the New American Standard, or you can read the English Standard Version, or you can read the New International Version, or a lot of other really, really good translations. But as good as those are, they're not exactly the same as reading something in its original language. And sometimes reading it in a translation can kind of cover up, or like, as one person said, kind of put a veil over what's going on. But that's the internal evidence, stuff that we have in the middle of it, inside of it. And as you could guess, if the first is internal evidence, the second is external evidence. No real surprises there, I wouldn't guess. And external evidence is just, what kind of evidence do we have that's not inside the Bible? In the case of trying to figure out things about the epistles, we might say, well, what does the early church, what do the early Christians think about this letter? Or what parts of history does it include? Or is it similar to other things, other texts that are outside of the Bible? And asking these questions can help us figure out some things about it. But at the end of the day, after we put all this stuff together, we still have to figure out what we want to do with it. In other words, we have to become the interpreters ourselves. How do we interpret what we've got? What do we think is stronger? What do we think about what's happening with the evidence? Are there more than one choice? Is there just one choice? How strong is the evidence? I guess if we were doing jury duty and keeping on with this sort of an idea, we might say, should we convict or not? Because there's a difference between thinking someone's guilty and proving them guilty. We have to have reasonable evidence. And so the same thing true with the Bible and with picking out what's going on with the author. And this is going to be especially true and especially complicated in some ways, although at the end of the day, I don't think it's too complicated, with the Epistle of 2 Peter. And so what we're going to do this morning, or for me this evening, is we're going to go through the internal evidence, then we're going to go through the external evidence, we're going to weigh it, we're going to deal with what's going on, then we'll look at the end of the class, the audience, and talk about how that's going to shift what we're going to do. So let's look then first at the internal evidence of what's going on here in 2 Peter. Now, you might think for a second, what sorts of internal evidence would we have? Well, the first and probably most basic idea of internal evidence is we can ask, well, what about the words that Peter uses? In other words, when we're reading 2 Peter, okay, what words do we have that play out? Well, this is one of the weird things, and one of the things that makes 2 Peter so odd, and there are a lot of them, is that he uses a lot of words that nobody else uses. Let me zoom in here so you can kind of see that a little bit better. There are only 401 different words in Peter. So in other words, like you only count the once, even if it's used a bunch of times. You only count Jesus once, even if it's used a bunch of times. There's only 401 different words. Of those 401 words, 57 of them, 57 are nowhere else used in the entire New Testament. That's what the exclamation mark and the equals, it means not equal to the New Testament. They're not anywhere else. They're only here, nowhere else. Maybe even more surprising to that, because the New Testament is kind of a short collection of documents, but the Septuagint is a lot longer. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Of those words, about 30, it's actually a little bit more than 30, don't occur anywhere in the Septuagint at all. About 30 of them, and this one's a little bit less than 30, not only do they not occur in the Septuagint, not only do they not occur in the New Testament, but they don't occur anywhere else in early Jewish literature. They don't occur in Josephus, they don't occur in Philo, they don't occur in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't occur in other apocryphal literature, and there's even a few that seem very, 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 very strange when it comes to this. And you're like, okay, well, that's a little bit strange. What do we do with that? Well, what else is there besides just the words that we use? It seems pretty strange, but hey, it's a strange book. Maybe that's just why. Well, when we compare it not just to that, but when we look at its style, and maybe the easiest way to think about style is because we don't think too much about style, but there's a big difference between is if you're going to pick up a newspaper, right? Or if you're going to pick up a novel, or if you're going to pick up a textbook, they're all going to be a very different style. Maybe a different way of thinking of that would be there's a difference in style in how you speak. If you're giving a speech, or a sermon or a Bible class or a Lord's Supper talk or offering a prayer, you have different diction than you would if you're just talking to a friend. And we can switch back and forth between those pretty well. Now, it is harder for people to switch back and forth that way in their writing. It's why a lot of people, if you've noticed, write how they tend to speak most commonly. And in antiquity, it's even more difficult to kind of change back and forth from your style. Now, there are two different kinds of main styles that are kind of around in the first century and its kind of centuries before and after that. And the first one that's more standard, where it's more obvious, the one that we're used to more in the Bible, is called this Attic style. And what happens is that from a few hundred years before Christ, then people started saying, okay, there's this Koine Greek, this common Greek that we've all been speaking. It's kind of really brought our style down, and we want to go back to the classics of Sophocles and these other plays and Plato and all these stuff like that, and we're going to reteach ourselves how to speak better. And that's more like what we have in like Luke or Hebrews or even First Peter. It's written according to this kind of highfalutin, very hoity-toity sort of a style. Now, the other major style guide is called this Asiatic style, and it's not very popular in some ways among the literary circles in the first century. It's more verbose, it talks about a lot of synonyms, it repeats itself a lot, it's a little bit less refined, but it's a lot more common among the people. Now, some people we do know could move back and forth between these two styles. A really famous orator that you might have heard of, Cicero, the famous Roman senator, general, things of that nature, he starts out in his life as a lower man. He calls himself a new man when he finally gets to the senatorial class. But when he's trying to get famous with the lower classes, he uses this Asiatic style. But as soon as he gets up into the upper echelons of society, he has to change his style to the Attic style because otherwise he won't be popular. It's pretty interesting how that works. Now, what this means is there is an enormous difference between, to just kind of tip the hand for a little bit here, go forward just one point. There's an enormous difference even in style and vocabulary between 2 Peter and 1 Peter. We might compare to like 1 Peter is like classical music and 2 Peter is something more like pop or country or rap. It's something that can be popular but not generally with the same sort of an audience in that way. They're just very, 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 very different. And those differences are in vocabulary, those differences are in style, the way they write, and there's some differences in other places as well. But even though there's so many differences between 2nd and 1 Peter, there's also a lot of similarities, particularly in the first kind of chapter or so of 2 Peter. In it, this one section in particular It looks a lot like First Peter. It shares 18 of these kind of 401 words. 18 of the words here are super important to First Peter, and they are some pretty key examples. In fact, there's one word that occurs in the entire New Testament only once in First Peter and once in Second Peter, and nowhere else in the Bible. So there's some similarities, right? And then we're going to read, and especially if you kind of have it in the forefront of your mind, the reason we put Second Peter and Jude together instead of First and Second Peter is because if you read through Jude, all of a sudden, 2 Peter chapter 2 is almost exactly like the book of Jude. Now, it's rewritten in a way. It's rewritten in this Asiatic Greek, but of the 25 verses, because there's only one chapter, of the 25 verses in Jude, 19 of them are in 2 Peter in the same order. Now they've been again reworked, but they're the same. They say the same verse. So that's a pretty important similarities, and that's kind of interesting because we don't really have that kind of a thing happening often in the New Testament. Now the closest thing we've got to that, of course, is Paul's letter to the Colossians and his letter to the Ephesians. They're pretty similar, but they're not this similar. We might say the Synoptic Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're pretty similar, but they're not this similar in that sort of a way. So that's kind of a strange thing to have there in that played out. But then we might ask, okay, well, what about Second Peter itself? What does it say? When we're reading it, what can we figure out about it? What does it say is going on? And you're like, well, why are we talking about evidence at all? It's pretty clear, right? We turn over in our Bibles to Second Peter chapter 1, and it says in verse 1, Simeon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. We look, say, hey, there you go, it's done. But even there, it's kind of strange. Because you notice Simeon Peter? Is that how he's normally referenced? No. We have Simon Peter named as either Simon or Peter or both 188 times in the New Testament. You know how many times in the entire New Testament, other than right here, he's called Simeon Peter? Just once in Acts chapter 15. And that's kind of strange. Simeon's the Jewish name. It's changed to Simon, and then it's even more changed to Peter, right? It's a Jewish way of speaking. And this letter doesn't seem particularly Jewish. If he was writing to a Jewish audience and wanted to kind of emphasize his Jewish ethnicity, then he might call himself Simeon. But in 2 Peter, unlike 1 Peter, there are no explicit Old Testament citations, which seems like a really weird thing to do if you're actually writing it for a Jewish audience. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But there's more weird kind of stuff going on here that could kind of just is bizarre. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, it says, this is the second letter that I'm writing to you. And we're like, okay, maybe he's talking about 1 Peter. Except there's so little that's the same in 1 and 2 Peter. It doesn't reference the same people. It doesn't reference the same situations. It doesn't even reference similar situations. And we wonder, is it talking about 1 Peter? Is that the first letter it sent? Or instead, is it kind of like when we read our 1 Corinthians? If you read 1 Corinthians closely, I think it's in chapter 5, it says, hey, I actually wrote you the first letter about this, this, this. And you're like, wait a second. I thought this was 1 Corinthians. And you actually realize, no, there's a real 1 Corinthians. What we call 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. So maybe this isn't even written to the same people. Again, we'll talk about this in a second. But that's kind of strange. Well, then we get into chapter 3, and there's a lot of little weird things in chapter 3 as well. So, for example, chapter 3, verse 2, right after this second letter business, he says, I've sent this to you, beloved, that you should remember the predictions of the holy prophets and the commandment of the Lord and Savior, which you received through your apostles. Your apostles. Now notice how he's talking about these things. The predictions of the prophets of the Old Testament. Okay, well, that's from a time that's not the author. Or the commandment of the Lord, again, that's not the author. And then when he says your apostles, it's almost like he's not including himself in that conversation. That's kind of a weird way of talking about things. Some people, a lot of people read this and say, well, that doesn't seem like something that's what Peter would write. It's kind of like when you read in Hebrews and it talks about, the delivered to the apostles, and it's kind of like, not me. And everybody says, well, no, Paul would never say that. Well, here the question is, would Peter say that? Some people say that's really strange. Other people say, well, no, if you read in Ephesians chapter 2, then it kind of sees the apostles as belonging to the church, and since he's writing to the whole church, maybe that's what's going on. But it's just strange. And then we have the same thing in the very next verse. They will say, where is the promise of your coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. And again, there's kind of two ways to read this. The first way is where the fathers is talking about kind of the first generation of Christian leaders, of which the author here is not a part. And the other people say, well, no, it's talking about the ancestors. It's talking about the patriarchs. It's talking about the people of the Old Testament, and it's going on there. But again, it's just a little bit odd. And then the last kind of odd thing that we see, well, not last odd thing that has to do with authorship is a little bit later in chapter 3, where he says that, he's talking about a group of Paul's letters that he's received and how they know them already. And some people are like, well, that's kind of strange. Peter dies pretty early. He dies somewhere between 65 and 68 years after Jesus is born, right? It's 65, 68 AD, right around there. And Paul dies, maybe probably a few years later, give or take, depending on when you have Peter die, but same basic time. And when are Paul's letters written? I mean, most of Paul's letters are written in the early 60s. So if he's writing to all of the church, is all of the church supposed to have all of Paul's letters? Do they just have some of them? Does, what's going on here? It's just kind of a strange thing to include. But, maybe he just means you've got some of Paul's letters. And that would make sense because, we don't think about this a lot, but Paul and Peter actually shared some secretaries, some people in mind. So, we read about Silas, who goes along with Paul, and we think about him with Paul most often, or he's called Silvanus, and he writes with Paul, according to 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 1, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 1, that Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy are the ones who wrote those epistles, actually physically wrote them down. It's called an amanuensis, a letter writer. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But Peter also uses Silvanus, the same Silvanus, as a letter writer for him. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12, it says, by Silvanus, a faithful brother, I regard him, having written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God, stand firm in it. In other words, Silvanus is also Peter's amanuensis. So it would make sense if they're sharing kind of the same amanuensis, or of course they both have relationships with Mark. Mark goes around with Paul during his first missionary journey, even he kind of nopes out a little bit early. Mark. But Mark is also the one who, and we have good reason to believe this, is the one who takes down Peter's view of the gospel and writes it down in our Gospel of Mark. And there may be one more, one that we'll talk about again near to the end of class, a guy named Linus, who is included in 2 Timothy chapter 4, one of the people who Paul longs to come to him and send greetings, who's in Rome. Now, if 2 Timothy is written while Paul is in Roman prison about to be killed, well, you know who else is either in prison or is about to be killed or has been killed when he writes that letter? In Rome, if we can believe tradition, Peter as well. So we have all these things going on, all these connections, and we have to say, well, wait a second, what are we going to do with that? Like, what does this mean? What does it matter? Some of these things look like they are really obviously written by Peter. Others seem a little strange. What do we do with that? Do we just ignore that? Do we just kind of pretend it doesn't exist? Well, a guy named Michael Green, who actually does believe that Peter, sorry about that, that Peter wrote this epistle very strongly, he still says this, and I think it's important for us to kind of recognize the difficulties too. He says, there is a weighty case against the apostolic authorship of 2 Peter. It would be idle to deny. Its style, diction, poor attestation, relationship with Jude, as well as its idiosyncrasies of content, make one inclined to assign it to the 2nd century. Now that's a big deal because remember, Peter dies in about 65 in the 1st century. So here, this guy who's a conservative who believes, ultimately we're going to see, that Peter wrote the gospel, he still says, look, we can't pretend these difficulties don't exist. I think that's an important thing for us as Christians to realize, that we need to be honest and we need to be open and we need to be recognized and say, look, some of these things are difficult. That's of course what Peter says, right? Some things Paul writes are difficult to understand. But we don't want to sweep it under the rug. And the reason we don't want to sweep these things under the rug, but instead want to confront them head on, is because we don't want to create a brittle faith. We don't want someone to watch this video or to be in church or be in a Bible class or to sit through a kid's class and be like, oh, well, I didn't think there was any problems. And then they get on the internet or they hear a friend or they're going through a hard time. And there are going to be some hard times that people go through. And that's some of actually what 2 Peter is going to talk about. And say, well, they didn't answer this question, so I'm just not going to believe anymore. But that's not what we're called to do. That God says that we're supposed to love the Lord with all of our mind and soul and strength. And I think one of the things to do is that we wrestle with things like this, to understand a little bit better about inspiration, about providence, about the power of God. And I think that once we look at all this, we can have a better appreciation for what's maybe going on here. But the second sort of thing that we're going to talk about is not internal evidence, but it's the other side of things. It's external evidence. External evidence is, of course, just the opposite side that we were discussing. It's not what's into the Bible, but exterior to it. We're not going to spend as long on this, but there's some interesting things. The most important evidence that we always ask when it comes to external evidence of the Bible is we say, hey, what did the earliest Christians think about this? Now, that may seem like a strange sort of a question. What does Origen or Eusebius or Jerome think about this? But it makes a lot of sense. Imagine, some of you, if I wanted to say, hey, what was going on in Palmetto 50 years ago? I could ask some of y'all, or y'all may not know yourselves, but your parents might know, or you might have heard of. In other words, if you're from that area and you were at the church building, then you're going to know. And a lot of these Christians, they would have known. They're from the cities, they're from the churches that Peter had visited or Paul had visited, so that their testimony, they kind of know what's going on a lot of the times. Doesn't mean they're perfect, doesn't mean they're inspired, but they're a good kind of first look to see what's going on. And so we can kind of look and get a better idea then of what they do say. And what they do say is pretty interesting in a lot of ways. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this morning. The earliest one, and it's not particularly early, the earliest church father to specifically talk about 2 Peter is Origen, who doesn't talk about it here until the 3rd century after Christ. So that's in the 200s AD. And he says this, but Peter, upon whom the church of Christ is built, against which the gates of hell shall not prevail, has left one epistle undisputed. Suppose also the second was left by him, for on this there is, though, some doubt. Now, that's kind of interesting, right? Now, this is in the broader context of what Eusebius is saying here. It's recorded actually in Eusebius. He's talking about, he's giving talking about all the books in the Old Testament. And then he talks about all the books in the New Testament, and he says, hey, yeah, we have this canon, and he catalogs the the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, then he talks about the letters of Paul, and then he talks about, hey, look, Peter's only written 1, maybe 2, and some people don't think he wrote the second letter. Well, what is that? The second letter of Peter. Now here, Origen is a Christian writing, and he's like, early on, we're not 100% certain of this. We got to figure out what's to do. And the reason he doesn't know what to do about this is because of those internal evidences that we were talking about. he's not trying to attack Peter's authorship. There's a few other things going on here. We'll see. But he says, we're not sure about this one yet. Well, the second text that's going to talk about this is a guy named Eusebius. Eusebius, who writes this thing called the Church History. And he says, as to the writings of Peter, one of his epistles, the one called the first, is acknowledged as genuine by everybody, because this was anciently used by the ancient fathers in their writings, as was an undoubted work of the apostle. But that which is called the second, so that's our second Peter, we have not indeed understood it to be embodied with the sacred books. In other words, we're not sure it belongs with the canon, but it appeared useful to many, and it was studiously read along with the other scriptures. Now this again is kind of interesting. Here Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, 3rd century, somewhere in there, he says, well, we're not exactly sure. And we're like, wow, they don't really believe that Peter wrote this? This seems like kind of a problem. But that's not exactly the case. We have this idea sometimes in our culture that the church fathers just bought hook, line, and sinker anything. They didn't really know about studying the Bible or things like that. That's not true. In fact, right after this, in the very next sentence of this Eusebius passage, he says, okay, it's not exactly like 1 Peter, but he says, but it's actually very, very different from everything else. He says, but there's other works called, quote, the Acts of Peter, or, quote, the Gospel according to Peter, not to be confused with Mark, and the preaching and revelations of Peter. And he says, these we know are not real, because there is nothing ancient among them, and none of the church writers of our day used them in the past, and we're not supposed to use them. In other words, he says 2 Peter is not like 1 Peter, but it is definitely not like these fake Peter documents that other people are writing and just signing Peter's name to them and pretending that they're real. In other words, there's a big distinction then what's going on. Now, there's one more major important kind of early attestations from a guy named Jerome, who's really, really important. And he says, we also have the 2 epistles attributed to St. Peter. They have different styles and turn phrases differently, by which it is discerned that it was sometimes necessary for him to use different interpreters, different translators, different people who are going to write out his letters, different amanuenses. Now notice what Jerome says. By the 4th century, by the kind of going into there, the end of the 4th century, he says, yeah, we all agree now that Peter wrote 2 letters. The reason we weren't certain about it is because they're so different in terms of vocabulary and style. I think it's useful to note here that, this kind of paying attention to vocabulary and style, that's not a modern thing. It's not a liberal thing. This is what the church fathers were doing from the beginning. And, it's kind of the same thing that, David and I do, or, Stephanie does when you get a paper and you can tell this student did not write this, right? We can tell. It's obvious when you do these sorts of things. But he says it's not like all this other stuff. And what he thinks he uses, he had 2 different amanuenses, 2 different translators. In other words, 2 different people that he spoke to, and they wrote down the letters in very different ways themselves. And that's pretty important. And when we look at the kind of other sorts of evidence as well, not just the church fathers, but other sorts of external testimony, then we can see that even if it's not used very, very early, unlike 1 Peter, and that is strange, that is kind of bizarre in a lot of ways, it is used by a lot of different early writings, especially writings present in Rome at the end of the 1st century, like 1 Clement, or the Shepherd of Hermas, or Ignatius, or a lot of other things that we don't necessarily know about, but we're writing in Rome at about 80 to 90, 80 to 100 years after Christ. And so they use these things, and even though when it gets kind of accepted into the canon is different, it's not present in something you might call the Muratorian canon, it's about 180, but that's not a crazy thing, and even though it's not included in the Syriac canon super, super early, it is later. But the flip side of that is that it's never rejected. They're just really careful. And I think that that is important for us to realize, because what we have in the Bible is not just some slipshod thing that people are like, oh, that looks good, throw it in. Or, oh, it says it's from Peter, we'll just accept that. No. Instead, these early Christians take very, very seriously the charge that what they need to do is recognize and discern and use their minds and their brains and their prayer and God's providence and figure out what really God wants them to have. And they're not willy-nilly about this. And so with 2 Peter, they hold off until they're sure. But they flat out reject a lot of other fake epistles to Peter, and that should then give us some confidence that this is different. But at the same time, some people still recognize that it's problematic. Erasmus, who of course is kind of influential in the creation of the New Testament and kind of putting all these manuscripts together, which leads to us getting a King James Bible and everything else like that. He says, I think that this must have been written by Silvanus, not by Peter, because it's just weird. Or Martin Luther, the Martin Luther said, I'm not sure it's written by Peter. John Calvin says, I think this is like a sermon that Peter preached, and that's why it doesn't look like Peter, but it's still Peter, right? And the reason they did that, and the reason why it kind of comes together, is these last historical markers that get played out in this whole situation. And what I mean by that is that even though all these other things are weird, here at least it's not. Here at least it's actually exactly what we would expect. And what I mean by that is, although a lot of the vocabulary and a lot of the stuff feels like 2nd century, and even though it's not referenced by early Christians the way we'd expect, which might lead us to think it's 2nd century, none of the stuff that it talks about at all fits the 2nd century. It all fits the 1st century, even the early part of the 1st century, and the time of Peter's life. We're going to talk about in a second, the way it talks about Gnosticism is not like the 2nd century. The church controversies that everybody who writes these kind of fake epistles and attributes them to Peter or to Paul or to anybody else that they want to talk about, the reason you do that, it's like you go to somebody and say, hey, my friend had a dream. I want you to tell me what it means. But we all know what that means. You had the dream, but you don't want it to be attributed to you. Or when someone says, hey, some people say this. Well, no, you're saying that. And that's what's going on with those sorts of things. And we need to kind of talk through them. In antiquity, the reason people would write a fake epistle and slap on someone really important's name on it was to attack a problem that they had or to prove a pet doctrine that they believed. Peter doesn't do any of that. When we read this epistle, it doesn't fit any of the major problems that arise in the 2nd century. In other words, it doesn't fit that time in its contents. Now, what we're going to do, and then we're going to just kind of preview how we're going to go about this for the next class, as we'll see in a second, is I want to bring up 3 sort of ideas, 3 options for how we do this, and then we're going to preview what we're going to do in next class. And go from there. And that is, what are our options? Well, the first option, and probably the one we're most comfortable with, is to say, well, Peter wrote it. Yes, it's got some problems. Yes, a lot of the stuff, the vocabulary and the syntax, and but they seem weird. But we don't read Greek, and that's not proof that he didn't write it. And you're exactly right. And people who emphasize this, we're exactly right. None of this stuff is so strong that it's proof that Peter didn't write it. But of course, if you're on the other side of things, you're like, well, Peter didn't write it. Because they're going to look at the same sort of stuff and they're going to emphasize the other side. Well, instead of emphasizing how similar in some ways 2 Peter is to 1 Peter, they're going to emphasize, well, it's different. Instead of emphasizing that none of the things that you proved are impossible, they're going to say, yeah, but that doesn't mean it proves that it is Peter either. In other words, there's all these complicated things, and both of these sides, the Peter wrote it and the Peter didn't write it, if we're being honest, they both have pretty strong cases. And I personally am not a huge fan when we have to kind of close our eyes a little bit at some of the evidence to make something fit. And so what I would suggest us to consider is, what if there's a third option? What if Peter didn't write it, but Peter didn't not write it? In other words, what if Peter preached this lesson? You know, if we read through, as we're going to go through 2 Peter, it reads a lot in some ways as a sermon. It reads as a last will and testament. It reads like Paul's last sermon to the elders in Acts. It reads like Moses' last sermon to the Israelites, or Joshua's last sermon to the Israelites, or Samuel's last sermon to the Israelites. It reads like this testament literature that he preached, and maybe he'd planned on writing it, but he's killed off before he can. He's martyred before this occurs. And then one of the people around him, like, for example, Linus, who is mentioned in 2 Timothy as being one of the Christians in Rome at the same time, who ends up becoming a really, really important church leader right after Peter, who is in Rome and accepted in this sort of circles. What if he then puts together this sermon that Peter preached to him and told him, hey, write it down, and he acts as an amanuensis, like Silvanus did in 1 Timothy, like Silvanus did to Paul, like Mark does for Peter with the Gospel of Mark. In other words, if something like this is the case, and it doesn't have to be this, and this isn't for sure, but if something like this was the case, that would explain why some of it is obviously Peter, but some of it seems weird. Because someone else is taking notes on Peter's sermon, and they're the one who puts it into the letter. And that is perfectly acceptable in the Greek world. We have lots of other examples of it. It's why some of Paul's letters read differently than others, is because of who is the author, the actual person writing it down, who's giving it the style and using the synonyms and all those sorts of things. And that's one possibility. I don't know if that's the case. But I do know something, and that is that this is Peter's words. This is inspired gospel. This is inspired text, that these are Peter's thoughts and Peter's words, but I also know that some of it's kind of weird. And I don't want to pretend that it's not. So those are some things that we can think about. And in the same way, we'll kind of just preview what we're going to do for next time. We're going to look at the audience by looking at the first verses of 1 and 2 Peter and asking if they're the same. We're going to look at the two possibilities for what the background is. And we're going to maybe, if we got time, get started into talking more about Peter's history. Now that we know that this is authentically Peter, let's talk about some of the things that happened to him in the Gospels that can kind of enlighten what's going to happen in our reading. We'll talk a little bit more about the Hellenistic background of the audience that we'll go through those other slides. And then we're going to go and introduce the first part of Peter. We probably won't make it through all first 11 verses, but that's kind of the first chunk, and we are planning to go through that in that way. Well, again, if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to throw them out. I look forward to seeing you again. I look forward to worship with you in the morning, and I hope that you have an excellent day as we get started to learn about how God's plan through Peter for all the churches and all the people who are seeking to do God's will is going to play out.